Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm the Rambling Director, and today we kick off the Lenten season. That's right, Lent is here. Get ready to give up something important to you for 40 days. I'm just thrilled. I thought, what better to kick off this period of 40 days of fasting and discipline than by talking about a movie that represents the beginning of the 40 years of Hebrew history in which the Hebrew people were disciplined by God and brought in line to become the great nation that they eventually would become. I'm talking, of course, about the Prince of Egypt. Now, I know you thought I was going to say the Ten Commandments, despite the fact that this video is called The Prince of Egypt. I know, I pulled a fast one on you. But trust me, if you've never seen this, it's definitely a movie that you need to check out. Any person who is kind of skeptical of it, I completely understand. If somebody told me, and I had never seen this movie, that one of the best productions which illustrate the Exodus story would be a animated Disney-style cartoon musical for kids, I would laugh at it. However, when you see it, you understand that this is a film rife with drama and intrigue, good comedy, dramatic moments that make you feel for really well-written characters. So let's start into it, shall we? The disclaimer immediately takes you by the hand and says, yes, don't worry, we love this story, we understand how important it is to you, it's as important to us, and we are going to get this right. They do refer to the fact that there is some artistic license taken to prove certain points or to make certain elements more relatable to an audience in the modern day. And that's perfectly fine. I think most of us expect that. However, the respect with which they treat us as an audience has never gone unnoticed by me. I really appreciate the time that went into making this movie, something that would be very well accepted and received by both Christians and Jews. Starting in, we immediately see the cruel slavery of the Egyptians. And this opening sets the perfect tone for that. We immediately understand the weight of these rocks, the harshness of these conditions. One of my favorite, but very understated bits of visual storytelling is when they raise a statue and it sinks into the hole that it's supposed to sit in. And we see a guy who braces for the impact of the statue falling on him, but also doesn't run. It's subtle, but he is welcoming death. He would rather that statue fall and kill him. He's not going to run, but yet he reacts to it like a real person, bracing himself for the impact. I've always particularly loved this one lyric that says, it's like a Cole Porter rhyme scheme. It's absolutely grand. The lyrics and the music in this entire film are really phenomenal. Even if you don't like all of the songs, you have to admire that these are some very well-worked lyrics, and they're given to us by the same man who wrote Godspell, a play which, while I like, I've never really thought was that grand in terms of lyrics, mainly because the lyrics are taken from old hymnal books, so didn't really get the chance to shine on that one, but here he definitely does. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam's mother, Yochebed, prays, and when she tells her son that she has nothing she can give him except the mere chance, the mere possibility that he may live, her lyrics turn into this gut-wrenching cry, which we hear again as she drifts the baby off in the basket. I think possibly one of the best animated scenes of all time in any movie comes from this film when Yochebed is pushing baby Moses out to sea, singing the River, O River part of Deliver Us. On that note, Deliver Us might be one of the best opening musical numbers ever. It's right up there for me with The Bells of Notre Dame. It's epic, it's powerful, it sends chills up my spine and brings tears to my eyes every time I see it. And the more I see it, the more powerful I find it. It is such a good scene. It is kind of funny, though, that she prays, River, O River, flow gently for me, and the river does everything except flow gently for her. Now, this is a little bit funny to me, I won't lie. But over the years, I've come to accept and appreciate that probably what they were trying to get across was that All of these dangers exist in the Nile, and yet God protected baby Moses and brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. Miriam says her final prayer over her baby brother, basically saying, now that you've been delivered, come back one day and deliver us too. It's powerful, and something else I like is that they're focusing on the story that is currently happening. So they don't try to make Miriam and Aaron into villains because one day they would badmouth Moses. No. We gotta see who these people were at this time period. Sure, they became that later, but a lot of stuff happened in the meantime. And at this point, we have to see them as a dysfunctional family that is trying to reconnect. One of my favorite parts is as Moses is carried off being named by his now Egyptian mother, the camera pans up over this sweeping vista shot of Egypt, and as the slaves sing out their final note, Yochebed's voice cries out over it, "Deliver us." I know some people are like, The Lion King, gives me chills when it cuts to that title. For me, it's Prince of Egypt. When she sings that final line and it cuts to black, that is just about the most moving experience I have had watching an animated film ever. We cut forward in time, and we see the adult Ramses and Moses, who are portrayed as college kids might be. They're kind of like frat boys. They're having a Chariots of Fire race around Egypt, up and down scaffolding. They're making these really cheesy and somewhat crude jokes. They even knock the nose off the Sphinx. Ha ha. Ha 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 ha. The early 3D animation is really, really good on this chariot race. I mean, remember that this was one of the early films that used this sort of combination of 2D and 3D animation. And so when we see it all put together and it still holds up to this day, that's pretty dang impressive. Now, I would like to address one thing. Ramses, the son of Seti. Yeah, we have to address that. Ramses was absolutely not the Pharaoh from Exodus. Relative certainty, it was one of about 2 people. But Ramses is not one of them. There is not even a debate to be had about whether or not Ramses was the Pharaoh. There's just too many things that go against it, and it's actually in the complete wrong time period for us to even try to date it to the Exodus. But I do completely forgive this movie for that, because it was probably taking a leaf from the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, made by Cecil B. DeMille, which, of course, is, the greatest pop culture icon of the Ten Commandments in the Moses story. So I forgive them for using the name Ramses. It doesn't bother me at all, but I did want to address it. Patrick Stewart as Seti, their father, is perfect casting. There's some wonderful shots of Seti standing in front of the statue of his own head in the background, and this is going to mirror some shots later, which I'll bring up. But I should also say that Ralph Fiennes plays a fantastic Ramses. Yul Brynner's character in the Ten Commandments is very two-dimensional. He's a mustache-twirling villain. Now, my gosh, Yul Brynner plays a great mustache-twirling villain, and he is one of the most likably unlikable characters ever put to film. But Ramses in The Prince of Egypt, he's a much deeper character. He's kind of a tragic hero. What I like about that is there's nothing really in the book of Exodus that would make you think the Pharaoh is entirely a bad guy. He could very well be a product of his time, somebody who just believed in building an empire on the back of slaves. It wouldn't be unbelievable. Everybody in his time period did exactly that. And he believed that Moses was trying to steal his quote-unquote property. So, yeah, I mean, sure, he did probably fight against God a little bit longer than is really necessary. But playing him as a tragic hero, who is somebody who's just trying to live up to his father's expectations, it humanizes him a bit. Remember, the Pharaoh in Exodus, for all his faults, was still human. Ramses is trying to defend himself against his father, but his father says that all it takes is one weak link to bring down a dynasty. Then Moses tells Seti, as Ramses leaves, you know what, maybe he just needs the opportunity to show you he can be responsible. Later on, Moses approaches Ramses and tries to cheer him up. Of course, this results in Moses getting Ramses into trouble again, and the two of them, as a brotherly bond, is established even further for the audience. In these early scenes, we get introduced to the two high priests, Steve Martin and Martin Short, who play Hotep and Hoi. And they get some truly good, funny lines.
You're in trouble, young man.
Get down here. I think you owe us an apology.
Oh, my new thing.
I am so upset.
This scene is going to be mirrored later during the plagues, when the enemies, Moses and Ramses, meet in the same spot. And I always loved that bit of foreshadowing. Some people have said that the jokes and the sense of humor in the first bit of the film are very cheesy. I don't mind that, and personally I don't find them too cheesy, but even if I did, I wouldn't mind for one reason. It's kind of important that we get this contrast of this idyllic palace life versus what will come later when the two have become enemies. At Moses' advice, Seti gives Ramses a position as the Prince Regent. He's going to be in charge of all of the royal temples. Moses suggests that Hotep and Hoi pay tribute to the new Prince Regent, which prompts Hotep and Hoi to offer Ramses Zipporah, the Midian Girl, a beautiful young woman who is going to become the private slave, if you will, of Ramses. Yeah, I too don't entirely know how they got by with that. This is also where we get our first indication that Hotep and Hoi, the high priest, are actually magicians, and that nothing they are doing is actually real. I kind of like this little element. In the Ten Commandments movie, they actually never really explain how the high priest do things like turn the staffs into snakes. Now, sure, the staff still get eaten by Moses' staff, but that doesn't change the fact that the priest actually did it. And we never really get much establishment that black magic or anything like it exists within the universe of this film. But by portraying the whole thing as smoke and mirrors and making it very obvious to a modern audience, we instantly see the difference between something like a Moses miracle and the high priest of Egypt. I also think this is a bit more palatable to a lot of parents who would rather their children see things like witchcraft as just being kind of goofy kid stuff, like a street magician. Next we get the what the heck is happening to those background people? Oh my gosh, that guy looks like he's ready to kill my hamster. Yeah, maybe we should address that. 99% of the animation in this is fantastically beautiful. But some of those background art faces, jeez Louise! Moses allows Zipporah to escape, and that's where he meets Aaron and Miriam at the well. They show kindness to Zipporah, and I always thought this was a nice subtle touch because the Torah is very specific about this, that treating strangers with kindness is very, very important. It's something that's reiterated throughout the Torah over and over again, both in the actual words, but also in the examples of people being portrayed treating other people with kindness. For instance, when we meet Rachel, she seems like a very generous soul who is willing to help just about anybody. By introducing Miriam and Aaron this way, they're sort of set up as the prototypical Jewish people. This sets up that the Hebrew people will be treated with respect throughout the rest of this movie. I also think Jeff Goldblum's casting as Aaron is frickin' hilarious.
Tell you, I knew he would return to us when he was ready.
Miriam, do you want us following?
Another fun but subtle little detail is that if you notice where the casting is concerned, all of the Hebrews are played by Americans, while all the Egyptians are played by English people, or at least British people to some degree. I thought that was a neat little trick because in addition to the characters ethnically looking different in terms of their animation, they all sound different too. Even Val Kilmer, although he sounds American, he has certain little English-isms to his voice, a little bit like Kelsey Grammer does when he's playing Frasier. He's kind of got that mid-Atlantic voice that you can't quite place, like, for instance, an American who has grown up around a lot of British people. Again, it's subtle, and it wasn't necessary, but it was nice that they put that extra little bit of thought into how they were going to cast this film. I always appreciated that. Moses does not believe that he is Aaron and Miriam's brother. In this version, he is not aware that he was a Hebrew until this moment. His parents simply never told him. He was always just the Prince of Egypt. He didn't know who he truly was. But earlier on in the film, we hear Moses humming the song that Yochebed had sang to him before placing him off in the basket. And so, as Miriam sings the same song to him, it jogs that subconscious memory, and he realizes that everything he's ever believed is a lie. This is where we get a great little song all about Moses' revelation, where he sings about how this is his home, Egypt is his home, and this, being an Egyptian, being a prince, this is all he's ever wanted. Isn't it? And during the course of this, he has a great little line that is foreshadowing for the very next scene. And you can see how this idea, by singing the song, might have been subconsciously planted in his head and led to the dream sequence we're about to see. He sings the lyrics, "I am a sovereign prince of Egypt, the son of a proud history that's shown, etched in every wall." Next we get a dream sequence, and this dream sequence is one of the most creative visions from a director I've ever seen. This dream sequence takes place entirely in the etched walls of an Egyptian stela. We see little 2D Moses and 2D Yochebed and Miriam and Aaron and all the soldiers killing the firstborn Hebrew children. The realization of this massacre is brutal. Seeing the children thrown into the Nile and the giant Seti the First painting, pointing, ordering it to happen. He is ultimately responsible. Moses wakes up. He runs and finds the stela, which he had subconsciously remembered, but he didn't realize the importance of it. Hundreds of baby Hebrews being cast to their deaths, eaten by alligators. This is such a dark moment that it makes me realize they really had to lean into that animation style to convince people that this was something that should be shown to kids. Now don't forget, I grew up in the 90s, okay? And we were running off the high of the 80s when you were still allowed to show kids dark, gruesome stuff. But by 1998, when this film was released, this would have been somewhat pushing it. And I mean, even by the older days standards, showing infanticide? That was pretty hard to get by with. Seti walks up behind Moses and attempts to explain the reasoning, that the Hebrews were just too numerous. They could have overthrown the Egyptians, and so he had to handle it. Moses says, "These were children. Please, Father, tell me you didn't do this." And Seti says, "Oh, son, they were only slaves." And that moment of horror and realization is when Moses understands the truth about who his so-called father truly is. The queen sings a song to Moses which offers him a harsh choice that a lot of us has to make. Would we rather have a comforting lie or a terrible truth? I really appreciate that, because Moses gets the option. Do I continue living my pampered palace life, knowing that the people that I truly belong with are suffering at my hands, or do I maybe have to leave this life and seek something else, anything else? I also think that it was a stroke of genius to add in some little elements that may show God's hand at work earlier on. During the Queen's song, she says, "When the gods send you a blessing, you don't ask why it was sent," referring to Moses being sent to live with them. This is a really nice little element, I think, because it shows how the Egyptian people, they can sense the hand of God and understand that it's there, and that God is actually acting in their lives. Yes, God sent her a blessing, but being brought up in the culture she was in, she took it to mean multiple gods. In the very next scene, Ramses says that he had a vision of a greater Egypt than his father. Now, that's kind of a cool element, because Egypt had to be at its greatest in this particular telling of the story in order for God to bring about the full might of his destruction on it. The greatest empire the world had seen at that point, brought to its knees by 10 separate horrific plagues. Another little element that is very different from the scripture, but is passable and I don't mind it too much, is that Moses sees a slave being beaten by an Egyptian caretaker, and he just runs in a fit of passion and pushes the Egyptian slave driver, and he falls off of a scaffolding and dies. It's an accident. Moses kills the guy by accident. He does it in front of everybody. It's in a moment of passion. In the Exodus, it's very clear, Moses waited until nobody was looking and went and murdered that man. But I don't mind it in this, because remember, this is primarily a version which is telling kids this story. Now, adults, we can understand somebody is evil, do they deserve to live? Do they deserve to die? The death penalty, when is that involved? But even we really struggle with them sometimes. And so you might not want to give that message to a kid just yet. So by portraying Moses' actions historically accurate, he did kill a man, but by changing the way it happened to make it a little more sympathetic for a child, that I think was a good move. Ramses tries to stop Moses, but Moses' intent, he has to leave Egypt. He murdered a man. Ramses says, we can take care of that. I'm going to be the Pharaoh. If I say you never killed him, then it will be so. But Moses says, what you say doesn't matter. What you say can't change what I've done. This is setting up that moral dilemma again. Ramses has been told to believe that when the Pharaoh speaks, reality changes. That as Pharaoh, he is a god, and what he says is reality. But Moses understands the truth of reality. It's also a nice parallel. When Pharaoh speaks, he can pretend things change, and maybe people move and do what he tells them, but he can't change reality. But when God speaks, oceans turn to blood. When God speaks, hail and fire can be married together and pour forth on a city. When God speaks, a darkness can descend on the land so thick that you can touch it. God's word changes reality. This is a Christian truth and a Jewish truth that has spanned throughout thousands of years. It is the preconception for all Christian and Jewish thinking. Ramses screams for Moses after Moses says, goodbye, brother. This is a nice parallel for the end of the film. Moses arrives in Midian after presumably many days of wandering through the desert. He saves the daughters of Jethro, the high priest of Midian, and Zipporah recognizes him from Egypt. Danny Glover plays as Jethro. He is fantastic in this role and really gives you a sense of why Moses respected Jethro so much. Remember, he might be the wisest man in the Bible who is not just being told things by God or getting wisdom from God. Remember, later on, Moses does take his advice about how to divide up the leadership of Israel. When Jethro just kind of shows up, I think it's in the book of Numbers, he shows up and is like, Moses, you are taking way too much on. You can't handle this. This is what you need to do. And Moses takes his advice. Danny Glover is also dubbed for his song, but you would never know it because the dubbing is so great. The dubbing in this film is what dubbing is supposed to be. Dubbing is like any other special effect. When you dub a singer with an actor, that singer should sound as much like the actor as possible. If you can make it seamless, that is the best way you can dub. Val Kilmer is dubbed, and I would never have guessed that. In fact, I thought, the first time I saw it, wow, I didn't know Val Kilmer could sing, because it sounds so much like him. Same with Danny Glover. Moses is honored at a feast by Jethro, but Moses tells Jethro, I've never done anything in my life worth honoring. Please don't do this. And Jethro says, he doesn't think Moses understands what is worth honoring. After all, he saved Jethro's daughters. And that leads Jethro to sing my favorite song in the film, Heaven's Eyes. This song is spectacular. The metaphors are brilliant. Can a thread within the length of a tapestry understand what it brings to the whole? Can a mountain made up of many rocks, can any of those rocks fully understand that without them the mountain wouldn't be the same? And that to fully understand the value of your life, you can't look through your eyes, because your eyes are part of the tapestry. You have to look at your life from the perspective of the one looking at the tapestry, and that's God, the one putting it all together. In the Bible, it just says Moses is out tending his flock when he sees a burning bush, and he stops aside to look at it to see why the bush is not burning up. In other words, the bush is on fire, but it's still there, like it's not burning away from the fire. However, in this movie, Moses is tending his sheep, a lot of sheep, and one of them wanders off, and Moses leaves the 99 sheep in the wilderness to find the lost one. Tell me I'm not the only one seeing this. Okay, I know. Again, you could say I'm reading into it, but I really think that was on purpose. When Moses departs his flock and goes into this little alcove, he sees the bush. There's just so much good about this scene. It's just a beautifully put together scene. The music. I don't know if I praise the music enough yet. The music, the background music, even without lyrics, is unbelievable. The fact that there's almost like these ripples moving away from the bush, which are sort of like the rings when you drop a stone into a pond. The way the color of the flame changes, depending on what God is talking about and what God is feeling. The voice of God is one of the most spectacular ideas I've ever seen.
I am that I am. I am the God of your ancestors.
You may notice that Val Kilmer's voice seems to be the most prominent voice, but you can kind of hear some other voices saying the lines with him. Now, of course, kind of going along with the Ten Commandments, remember, Charlton Heston talked the voice of God in the burning bush, and that was because Charlton Heston himself suggested the idea, saying he felt like the voice of God would come from within you. That's a cool idea, and they kind of go with that. But in order to add an extra ethereal layer, most of the cast actually voiced God, and their voices are all layered together into sort of a chorus. It just happens to be that the voice of Val Kilmer, Moses, is the most audible voice in that moment, because that's the voice that Moses would hear, the voice of his own heart. Another little element is the ethereal fire. In order to depict the burning bush, they had to come up with some creative ideas. How do you represent the unrepresentable God? Well, instead of drawing an actual fire, draw a fire that's representative. It's more kind of to give the idea of flames rather than actually depict them. These artists definitely could have drawn real flames if they wanted to. I love that they kept in Moses arguing with God. This is an important part of Judaism and, to a lesser degree, part of Christianity, but it really is something Christians should embrace. Remember that the father of our faith, Jacob, was renamed Israel because the name Israel means he who wrestles with God. In other words, there's this constant attitude throughout the Torah and into the later books of the Old Testament of these people arguing with God all the time. Like, God says something, and they're always coming back at him with something. And God rarely ever loses his patience with it. He reasons with them. He argues with them. Sometimes he concedes to them. Sometimes he gives them things not because he can't get his way, but because God wants our participation. The scene is significantly shortened from the actual way it's ran in the book of Exodus. I think a part of that is because in order to keep the story flowing, they had to take out the part where Moses is like, I'm really slow to speak to people. Can you get somebody else? And God's like, oh, fine, send Aaron. So instead, that is all cut out, and Moses has more autonomy. But again, this had to be done to serve the story, and since every other version, Moses has been the one who goes to the Pharaoh and says, let my people go, even though Aaron was the one who actually said that. I love that God is presented as mighty, and when God speaks authoritatively, it is kind of scary. But then, when he speaks gently, you really believe that this is a God who loves every single one of us. So he's mighty, but he's gentle. The booming-voiced, preachy voice of God in the Ten Commandments isn't bad, but I just see that God as a stern parent, whereas the God of the Prince of Egypt is very much a real parent. He's stern, but he loves his kids too. This also sets up the friendship between God and Moses, which is never really depicted in this film, but we know comes later. God would speak directly, face-to-face, well, almost face-to-face, with Moses in the tabernacle and on the mountaintop. So it is really a nice setup that God and Moses have this intimate relationship, and Moses is constantly hearing the voice of God whispering, literally a still small voice within him whispering. This also is one of the few films that I've ever seen that depicts what it's like, realistically what it's like, to have a religious experience where you feel the presence of God. Then we get a parallel shot of Moses coming off the mountain and looking down at the place where he would eventually deliver the Ten Commandments to his people. When Moses goes back to the tent, he tells his new wife, Zipporah, all about what happened, about meeting God. But I particularly love the way they decided to show it to us. It's all without words. It's all music and animation. Moses is clearly flipping out, and Zipporah is not sure what to make of any of it. But the way that they interact and the joy, the schoolboy joy of this man who's getting into middle age as he tells his wife, the beautiful experience of God that he's had, it's really heartwarming. Moses returns to Egypt, and we see Egypt has changed. Although the structure is shown from afar in another great vista shot as being a far greater city than the one Moses left, we also see that the slavery conditions have deteriorated. The Hebrew people are being treated worse than ever. We also hear another brilliant piece of scoring in the music. This time, although there's not really any words to be had, it's sort of this ghostly voice, and yeah, it's the same voice of the woman who plays Moses' mother, Yochebed. And it's almost like a ghostly, ominous warning, sort of like a reiteration of how badly the people need to be delivered. Another reason why Moses approaches the throne of Pharaoh for the first time alone, and we cut out all of the stuff where God talks to Moses and says, yeah, you will be God to Aaron and he will be your prophet, is because that probably would have been a little confusing for kids. And this also allows us time to show Moses and Ramses reunite as brothers. Instantly, Ramses pardons Moses for his past crimes. And I like that little element because we do kind of wonder, I think, when we read the book of Exodus, exactly why Moses was able to just waltz right back into Egypt with no problem. But that does make sense of that element of the story. I always loved that Moses turns his staff into a snake. It's a beautifully done piece of animation. And then Ramses just kind of looks at it like, seen it. It always cracks me up. Like, just how nonchalant he is about what appears to him to be magic just happening around him. And he's just completely used to it. Hotep and Hoi then come out to perform the quote-unquote same trick and turn their staffs into snakes. I love this song. I'm going to be honest. It does for me what the Gargoyle song in The Hunchback was trying to do and failed epically at. It's not only dark and epic, but when it turns into a Vegas-style magic show, strangely, the juxtaposition of the imagery and the music really works. Also, Steve Martin and Martin Short singing this song together, it's a match made in heaven. No pun intended. I can also imagine that a lot of fundamentalist evangelicals and Baptists who saw this movie were probably really freaking out when the magicians start chanting the names of the Egyptian gods. I mean, that's the sort of thing I can see some really high-strung Karen taking their kid out of the movie over, even though they are being portrayed as the bad guys. There's also, again, the acknowledgement that this is all smoke and mirrors, that they are just magicians. Now, I understand some people would say, based on things Paul said later, that maybe the Egyptian gods and goddesses were demons. But my response to that is, if you don't want this to end up being like the Star Wars prequels, where we're just sitting down and all talking about theology for 3 hours in between the plot-related elements, then you have to pick a lane and just say, yes, the magicians are doing black magic, and give some explanation, or just make it obvious to the audience that they are tricking the Pharaoh and everybody around them in order to maintain the power they have. And honestly, that's not unbelievable. We know that some of that did go on. And the Bible itself never really takes one stance or the other. Not about the priest of Egypt, anyway. And there does come a point at which the priest of Egypt cannot replicate the plagues. That's why they stop being mentioned after a certain point. I've also really loved this lyric in their song, where they sing, "By the might of Horus, You will kneel before us, kneel to our splendorous power. That line is, the rhyme by itself is just freaking hilarious. Moses and Ramses then have an argument about why Moses has come back. And Moses tells him, yes, in fact, the only reason he came back to Egypt was to free the slaves. And Moses gives Ramses back the ring that Ramses had given him. Just look at the stellar animation. I know a lot of people have picked this scene particularly to illustrate the phenomenal animation of this film, but really look at the range of expressions. Clearly, they really care about these characters and getting across everything that the characters are feeling and going throughout this film. During Moses and Ramses' argument, they also reframe Ramses the way they framed Seti. So we see Seti's statue in the background, but we also see that a bigger statue of Ramses has been erected, as he is saying that he built a better, greater Egypt than that of his father. In other words, he spent his entire adult life trying to live up to Dad. Ramses then doubles the workload of the Hebrews. I think this was probably another good cut. If we went into the facets of how he actually made the Israelites go out and find their own straw to make bricks with, as adults, again, I feel like we could handle it, but in the case of children, we want to keep this a little bit more simplistic. Aaron approaches Moses and throws mud in his face. Moses apologizes for their workload being doubled and says he was only trying to do what God told him to do. And Aaron replies with a simply great response. He says, "When did God start caring about us?" And then, for that matter, Moses, when did you start caring about slaves? Was it when you found out you were one of us? That's a great line, and I'll tell you why. Especially for a kids' movie. Now, I know I've talked about how some things need to be, they're a little too abstract and they need to be simplified for kids. But this is one that is a little bit harsh, but it's also something that kids need to understand. That as religious people, Christians, Jews, as we grow up, we're going to encounter times when we feel abandoned by God. And that it's okay to acknowledge that and fight with yourself about it and realize, actually, God does care about us, but it is easy to feel like God has abandoned you. And Aaron has the wrong attitude about it, and Miriam calls him out on that. But it is important to acknowledge that it's a legitimate feeling. Not that he is responding in the best way, but that it isn't something to be ashamed of when you have those sort of questions. It's also something that is, again, reiterated. Miriam says, "Moses, I've been a slave my whole life, and God has never answered my prayers until now." This is another completely legitimate feeling for Miriam to have. Although God is always hearing their prayers, God has never abandoned them. But in this time of fear and doubt and hardship, it is easy to forget that. God, of course, is the very thing that holds the substance of the universe together. Through him, with him, and in him all things exist. Without him, there is nothing. Nothing can exist if it is separated from God. Not truly separated from God. Yet it's legitimate to feel as though God is not answering your prayers, or your prayers are in vain, which is what Zipporah says later on in her song. But Miriam has the proper response. Instead of blaming God and blaming others the way Aaron does, Miriam says, God has never answered my prayers till now, or at least it doesn't seem like he has. But he brought you to be the deliverer he promised, and God's word is good, even if it's arriving late for some people. Even if she can't see that God is fully on time, in his own time. She realizes we have to be persistent, because God is hearing our prayers now, and that's what matters, and God will not give up on you. She says, God will not abandon you, Moses, so don't abandon us. This inspires Moses, and he gets back up. He goes down to the Nile where the Pharaoh is sailing on a boat. He lifts his staff as the voice of God speaks to him, and the Pharaoh's soldiers are approaching. And the Nile turns red. During all this, the Pharaoh says, I've had enough of this Hebrew nonsense. Hashtag cancel Ramses, am I right, boys? I always really loved the fact that if you look closely, they don't draw a lot of attention to it, but if you look closely, the Nile's blood red color actually doesn't touch Moses. The priests are still doing their magic tricks, and so they turn some water in a bowl red. They do this with, obviously, some sort of chemical or powder which changes the color. And I always thought it was really funny that Aaron says, Moses, what are we going to do? I mean, the Pharaoh's priests, they did exactly the same thing. Because I'm always like, Aaron, did they really do exactly the same thing? I mean, the scope, the scale, the fact that they had to, literally put chemicals in the water to do that, it's not quite the same thing there. I also love that when Ramses has had enough of this, he says, it's finished. And he thinks that ends it, because when Pharaoh speaks, the universe changes. But Moses counteracts that and says, no, Ramses, it's only just begun. And of course he's right. Moses then gives the Jews a pep talk. And, I have actually heard some people, being critical of the film who've said, it is one of the worst pep talks ever. I disagree, though. Because, if I said to you, listen, you're right. He can take everything from you. He can take your lives, he can take your children, he can take your cattle, he can even kill you. But the one thing he can't take from you is your faith. Now to you and me, living in a first world country in the 21st century, that seems like a pretty bad pep talk. But then you think about the fact that he's saying this to the Jews. The group of people whose basically their entire history can be summed up with, and then it got worse. I mean, these are a group of people whose faith literally is the only thing they've been able to keep this whole time. Everything else has been taken from them, including their lives, repeatedly throughout history. The Jews are the most victimized people in the entire history of planet Earth. And so saying, yeah, you know what, the Pharaoh can take everything from you. He really can. Let's just acknowledge that as a truth. But you know what he can't take? He can't take your God away. And when it comes down to it, your God is the most important thing. Because he is the God of the universe. He is the God who everything you do is, you are in his gentle, loving care. From the way you tie your shoes in the morning to the way you lay in your bed at night, there's nothing you do that is disconnected from him. Now we get to the plague song. This song is unbelievable. And then we launch right into Moses and Ramses. Moses sings, once I called you brother, once I thought the chance to make you laugh was all I ever wanted. And even now I wish that God had chose another. Serving as your foe on his behalf is the last thing that I wanted. Moses says, you who I called brother, why must you call down another blow? Let my people go, thus saith the Lord. A lot of people get the idea that God hardened Pharaoh's heart every single time. However, such as Exodus chapter 8, verse 32, where it refers to Pharaoh hardening his own heart. And he does that many times before God hardens Pharaoh's heart. So by that point, really, it's not so much Pharaoh not having free will, as Pharaoh is just continually doing the same thing, so it really wouldn't matter, in a way, if God hardened his heart or not. Ramses says, you who I called brother, how could you have come to hate me so? Is this what you wanted? Then let my heart be hardened, and never mind how high the cross may grow, this will still be so. I will never let your people go. I really enjoyed that little line. I mean, it's just one verse that Ramses gets in this song, and Rafe finds his singing is very raw. It's very throaty. Clearly he's not a singer, but his emotion that he drives through is just incredible. And this little verse gets across the full scope of what a tragic moment this is for two brothers. Now, of course, this is a little counteracted later when Ramses does have a conversation with Moses and realizes that, actually, this is not entirely just between the two men. Again, I just want to reiterate, this song is just an incredibly composed piece of music. It gets across the full scope of the plagues and makes them look mightier and far worse than the Ten Commandments ever pulls off making them look, despite the fact that the Ten Commandments actually gives you a really long time to see all the plagues being enacted. Another little element that you just never see in these movies is that when the darkness pours in, the statues begin to crumble. Remember that Moses actually prefigured this in the little joke he tells at the beginning.
Statues cracking and toppling over, the Nile drying up, you will manage to bring the greatest kingdom on earth to ruin.
Foreshadowing the events later. Again, the reason I'm pointing this out is because no other version that I've ever seen has shown God taking judgment on the gods of Egypt. In fact, the Bible says God will take judgment on the gods of Egypt, but it never details exactly what that means or how he does that. But by seeing the statues of the other gods collapsing, we get a visual depiction of that, which is very quick and easy to understand. I am aware that there is a theological argument that some people say each one of the plagues related to one of the gods of Egypt. However, there's a few plagues that do not relate to any specific god, and so that is a little hard for me to accept that argument. I'm not sure that the plagues really had anything to do in relation to the gods of Egypt. Moses revisits his childhood home. It's sort of almost shot for shot his song as he sings about being a prince of Egypt. But now everything is torn up, everything is destroyed, and of course enveloped in darkness. And when he comes in and finds Ramses in the same spot where they had talked when they were young teen boys, it's really heartrending to see how their relationship has deteriorated between now and then. The final argument between these two is really great. It starts off with malignance between parties, but then it turns into reminiscence about the past, a mutual understanding, a rekindling of that brotherly love, and then ends with the crashing back to reality of Pharaoh's son walking in, and the young child asking his father Ramses, why are you talking to this man? Isn't this the man who had done all this to Egypt? And Ramses says, yes, son, and one has to wonder why. Moses responds with the only response there really is, because no empire should be built on the back of slaves. Everybody is precious in the eyes of God, and they deserve freedom. Freedom is a natural-born human right. Moses warns Ramses, don't do this, think of your son. And Ramses vows, you know what, my father said he had the right idea about you Hebrews. I'm going to finish the job. And it cuts out and cuts to a wider shot, and we see that we are in front of the stela, showing Seti ordering the murder of all of the children. This is a fantastic visual. The cutting, the way it seamed together, the way they give Ramses the phrase that God would later use. There will be a cry in Egypt, such as never has been, nor never will be again. This is a great way of connecting the two moments. The Torah has a recurrent theme of what you do that is wrong will eventually cycle back around to bite you. This happens with Jacob and Esau. It happens with the brothers of Joseph. It happens over and over and over again throughout the entire Old Testament. One pharaoh of Egypt orders the deaths of the firstborn Hebrews. God responds in kind by saying, you took the firstborn Hebrews, I will take the firstborn Egyptians. This is really bringing that home by having Ramses say, this is my plan. There will be such devastation that there will never be such weeping in Egypt before or since. And God says, with that, Ramses, you have sealed the fate of all of the Egyptians through your stubbornness. Cuts back to that stela, and we see the Hebrew children being thrown into the Nile, being thrown to the alligators, and below, at the bottom, the child of Ramses standing there, as if he is the next in line of the children being thrown down. Visual storytelling at its finest, people. Depicting the natural way that this has to go. Death begets death. We cut to a very brief and very effective summing up of the first Passover. It's Moses just telling them about procuring a lamb, killing it and eating it, and then smearing the blood on the door frames and lintels of all their house. Of course, we don't want to see the lambs getting sacrificed. That would be a little bit much for a children's film. So instead, we cut right from the explanation of the Passover to the actual spreading of the blood on the doors. And then the angel of death arrives. The angel of death, or some people think that it might have been the Spirit of God himself. Just depends on your translation and your interpretation. We'll say for the sake of this that it is the angel of death. It's magnificently created here, given this wispy appearance. I think that's kind of a cool way of representing an angel, because naturally they would not, in their physical form, look anything like a human being, although they can disguise themselves that way. Also, the angel of death coming out of heaven and into our dimension is really cool, because there's like this spirally thing that looks sort of like it's a tear in space and time, or maybe another Elon Musk project gone terribly wrong. After the children all die, and yes, we see bodies because it's that kind of movie, we hear the great cry in Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again. Man, the crying out of those parents over the dead bodies of their children is really harsh. I mean, for a movie that looks so much like a Disney film, this is a really harsh sound to add in. But it's so important for the way they handle what comes next. Ramses is heartbroken, and when we see him, we're heartbroken too. Remember, we've humanized this guy, and we kind of understand where he's coming from. And when he's heartbroken over losing his child, after already having to lose his brother twice, this is really heartbreaking. His obsession with his father's expectations of him have brought him to ruin and lost him his own son whom in all likelihood he would have done the same thing to. Then, and this is why I said that hearing the cries of the parents is so important, Moses leaves the temple and collapses and sobs. This is really important because we have to remember that Moses was a good man. He was a righteous man. When we see that, we have to remember that Moses would have looked on this and understood the human cost and how high it was. He was not a robot. This would have affected him. Especially the Moses who we see at the beginning is so heartbroken over the slaves being killed. Surely the lives of all these innocent children would also affect him in some way. As Moses returns, we see all of the Hebrews coming out of their homes, all looking really scared and unsure. Can we leave? Is this really the end? After everything, can we really be free? And also, they all seem to feel the weight of this too. That a massive amount of people just died, and a lot of people had to be brought to their knees in tragedy to give them this freedom. And so there's a real quiet, somber respect for Egypt as the Hebrews are leaving, despite what they put them through, which makes us, and gives us an even more elevated view of the Israelites. That quiet praise in the face of all of the bloodshed that have to happen is represented in a song sang by Miriam and Zipporah. It's called When You Believe, and it is my second favorite song in the film. It is sadly triumphant, and it builds into the joy of freedom, talking about how for a long time they prayed with not really any hope left that God was hearing them. And although they had lost all hope, they still had, in some way, the hope of the promise of God living deep within them. Then, as the Hebrew people are making their way out in the song When You Believe seems to be coming to an end, we get the voices of children beginning to sing in Hebrew the praise of God. Now, I am actually learning Hebrew. I'm trying to become fluent in it, but I haven't quite got there yet. So forgive me, please, if my pronunciation is a little bit off on some of these lines, but I'm going to try to do my best. It goes like this. Ashira la Adonai ki ga'o ga'a, which means, I will sing to the Lord, for he has gloriously triumphed. Mi chamocha be'elim Adonai, which means, who is like you among the heavens, O Lord? Mi chamocha nedar bakodesh, which means, who is like you, majestic in holiness? Machita vahastacha amzuga alta, which means, you lead the people you redeemed with love. They repeat this a few times, and it builds from a quiet children's song into the song of an entire people who finally can embrace the joy of being a free people. They come to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh arrives dramatically. That's when the pillar of fire descends from heaven, guarding them and protecting them. Moses approaches the Red Sea, lifts his staff as the voice of God tells him, with this staff you will do my wonders. Moses drives the staff into the sea. The water shoots up into the air as if blown down by a great wind, just as the Bible describes. And just look at this. Is there even any use in me trying to commentate about this? Look at what a beautiful scene this is. In my mind, this is the definitive version of the crossing of the Red Sea ever put to film. It is the most dramatic, the most beautiful, and for my money, probably what I would imagine would be closest to what really happened. And while the Ten Commandments is an amazing effect, not just back in the day, but now, that effect holds up really well. I mean, there are aspects of it that if you didn't know how they did it, you probably still couldn't figure it out. But this, there's just no contest. This feels like a biblical miracle. It's also just one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen. I want every single camera set up, framed and put on my wall. It's just unbelievably beautiful, and the amount of artwork that the Prince of Egypt's depiction of the Red Sea crossing has inspired is baffling. I mean, even people who've never seen this movie, this tends to be what they think of when they think of the crossing of the Red Sea. The Hebrews cross, and right as they get to the end, the sea walls collapse and wash away Pharaoh's army. Pharaoh is tossed back onto the shore, and there's another thing we need to kind of look at. That deserves an explanation. Now, I know a lot of you out there are very anti-tradition. You're, hey, all we need is the Bible. We don't need all of your dirty traditions. But there is something to be said about the amount of traditions you embrace, and you just don't realize it. One of the things is that the Bible never actually says for certain that the Pharaoh did die. Let me make my case. In Psalm 136, verse 15, it says that God, quote, overthrew Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. In Exodus 14:28, it says, all the army of the Pharaoh were washed away. However, the Pharaoh himself is not actually mentioned. And in Exodus 15:19, it says, for the horses of Pharaoh went with his chariots and his horsemen into the sea, and the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them. Now, I understand these are the Pharaoh's horsemen and the Pharaoh's soldiers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Pharaoh himself did die in the Red Sea. There's actually a lot in terms of Hebrew scholarship and Christian scholarship, which goes both ways. Did the Pharaoh die in the Red Sea, or did he live? It's kind of hard to tell, and honestly, there's no general consensus one way or the other. Especially if we accept some of the more common names for who the Pharaoh actually was. It's widely believed that Pharaoh Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and if that was the case, then he lived about 20 to 30 years after those events. It's not a major plot point. I mean, after all, there are bigger things they changed, but I did think it merited an explanation that he lived. Same with the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille. The Pharaoh lives at the end, and that was obviously for dramatic effect. The Hebrews in this case automatically start rejoicing. Because it's the Pharaoh's army that dies, we don't have to feel as bad for them as we did with the children. As soon as the army is washed away, we get a moment of shock and kind of stillness as the Hebrews accept, oh, hold on, wait a minute, this actually just happened. Remember that in the Bible, they get to the edge of the Red Sea and the people start fussing at Moses, saying, like, what did you bring us out here into the desert to die? When they get across to the other side, though, for a while, it says that they actually trusted God and Moses as a result of the Red Sea. As the movie begins to wrap up, Moses stands apart from the others. He hugs Miriam, and there's a little moment where they kind of connect, like, visually, yeah, this is what it was all about. But then Moses steps to the side. He looks out across the Red Sea. We cut to a shot of Ramses sitting on the rocks, or kneeling on the rocks, and he's shouting to the heavens, Moses! And it's kind of a little way of reconnecting back to that earlier scene where Moses originally departed from Egypt, running away out of shame. But in that case, Ramses was shouting after Moses because he was simply losing his brother. But in this case, he's shouting at Moses, possibly out of anger, but reading more into it, you can see that this is sort of like the final cry of a man who has lost everything, and even lost the most important relationship in his life, that of his brother. And in response, Moses replies, just as he did earlier, goodbye, brother. This time, not leaving out of shame, but leaving in triumph, leaving to do what God has led him to do. And instead of the brothers leaving with Moses in ruin and Ramses having this bright future ahead of him, the roles have been reversed now. These are very simple lines. I mean, literally, it's Moses, ! Goodbye, brother. There's not a lot to these lines, but Ralph Fiennes and Val Kilmer, their delivery, along with the animation, along with the context of a brilliantly woven screenplay, it adds a real power, a heartbreaking power, to these final lines. Then yet again, using the expert visual storytelling, which no doubt is the reason why DreamWorks became a popular household name. It's kind of a shame they didn't continue down this path of more serious films, because they clearly were very good at it, instead of going for more comedies that often are very lowbrow humor. In this case, they show, purely through visuals, that same angle we saw Moses coming down off of Sinai when he had received the message from the burning bush, but this time he's coming down with the law. We didn't get God telling Moses, you'll come back here and deliver the law, like he does in the Bible, but we don't need to hear it because we visually see it. Moses walks down holding the 2 tablets in his hand, overlooking the crowds of Israel. Another little thing that merits at least a passing mention, is that obviously in the events of the actual Exodus, this was when, these were the final moments Moses had before throwing the tablets down and basically punishing the people in the hopes that God would not punish them, grinding the golden calf into dust and making, I believe he makes people eat it, actually, if I'm remembering correctly. And this is a far more triumphant moment at the end of this film than it was in real life. But we have to end on this sort of big high note. I mean, this is a musical. We can't go out on a downer note. So, the final little hint, though, that this might actually be implying what is coming next with the golden calf and with things going downhill for the Israelites, is that the final line of the movie is actually not Moses saying goodbye, brother. It's the ghost-like voice of his mother, Yochebed, reiterating her line from the end of the first version of the song Deliver Us. And that's what closes the film. So it's almost as if to say, yes, they've been delivered from Egypt, but the cycle will start again. So in a visual and musical way, they are implying what comes next while leaving us on a triumphant image, Moses receiving the 10 Commandments. Just to sum this up as we close, if you haven't ever seen this film, I highly recommend it. If you have the Peacock streaming service, then you can watch it for free. If you've never seen it, do give it a chance, because even if you're not a big fan of these Disney sort of style musicals, or if you're not a fan of musicals at all, but you are a big fan of the story, then do just kind of give it the opportunity and see if it can capture your attention. If you're into this sort of scriptural interpretation, doing something really new with the story of something like Moses or Jesus, or there's another film in this very series made by DreamWorks, which is about Joseph and his dreams. I do recommend this as a film in and of itself, even if you cut out the songs, because it really gets across the message of this story in a succinct way. The Ten Commandments is 4 hours long, and really, who has that kind of time? I mean, just realistically. But the Prince of Egypt is only an hour and 40 minutes. It's shorter than most modern movies by like an hour. It really is one of those films, and I know I say this a lot about the films I highlight on this channel, but it's one of those films that just gives to you, and it really takes nothing away from you. I've watched this film probably 5 times in the last 2 weeks, just preparing for this video, and I can say, every time I've watched it, it's been time well spent. So I highly recommend it, especially if you are a Christian or a Jew who loves this story, really is moved by the content of these scriptures, and maybe you want to see it reinterpreted in a way that is going to be more palatable to a modern viewing audience than something like the Ten Commandments. So thank you all for watching. I hope you have a wonderful Lent, and we will see some more of these religious themed films coming up in the next couple weeks, as we will be highlighting them leading up to Easter. So join me over there, and we might actually talk about another Ralph Fiennes film, but I'll leave that as a surprise. So thank you everybody for watching, God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.